to somewhere out there. I'm your host, Joe Hero, and in this episode we're going to be exploring Chapter 5 of Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time, entitled NBC, The Catalyst. We're going to go back to January of 1979, when Harry Lynn, a producer from a New York City news station, contacted Bud in regard to a documentary he was making on the UFO alien phenomenon. In December of the prior year, Bud had been on a radio interview and had received a call in from Dennis McMahon, an individual who had phoned in on the radio show to tell of 2 UFO sightings he had had in 1969. One involved multiple witnesses to a UFO flying slowly above the railroad tracks in Pearl River, and the other incident, Bud suspected highly, had been an abduction. Bud suggested that Harry accompany him on a real UFO investigation for his documentary. Now, before Bud even met with Harry, he had interviewed Dennis, visited both sighting areas, and had convinced himself of Dennis's credibility. The event that Bud suspected to be an abduction was explained to Bud to happen such that Dennis and his friend, Paul Federico, had met on a Friday night on a little road overlooking DeForest Lake to make plans for the rest of their evening. Federico had seen a reflection on the dashboard, and after pointing it out to McMahon, they had both jumped out of the car to see a UFO hovering about 35 feet above a telephone pole. A bright beam of light emanated from its underside, and multicolored lights made a row around its outside. McMahon's account concluded with the fact that the car would not start until they waited a few minutes, and then they tried again, at which time the car started, and they drove off toward Clarkstown to report the incident to the police. The craft followed their car for a while before speeding away. Paul Federico's version of the story was virtually identical, though the 2 men had not talked in over 3 years. Bud noticed a nagging deficiency in both men's narratives, however. They began it with the noticing of the reflection of the UFO, and then jumping out to see it. And they ended with them trying to start the car unsuccessfully before driving off to the police station ultimately. Neither version had a middle to their story, though. Bud checked the police record of the report incident, and it appeared that the event happened that between 7 and 7:30 p.m., 3 boys, including Douglas Sharkey, met on the road above the lake to discuss plans to find some girls when the UFO was seen. A time lapse ensued, ending with the boys back in their car and driving to the police station, a drive of less than 15 minutes. The report was filed at 10:23 p.m., however. 2 hours were unaccounted for. This is, incidentally, the most common missing time frame recorded. At this time, it is interesting that Harry had been gathering Rockland County material for his UFO documentary, and Bud was able to produce, through a peripheral circumstance, a case probably from 1965, where a lady known as Mrs. Bennett and her daughter Renata had been lying on cots outside observing constellations when a light larger than a star rapidly sped toward them and hovered high up, casting a light on about a quarter-acre space. The ladies ran inside to tell the others what they had seen, and they met Mr. Bennett and another child who was still awake. And that proves that the incident did not end late into the night. But after separate interviews, it was discovered that both ladies remembered significantly different parts of the same incident. The daughter did not recall that there had been a beam of light coming from the craft, and the mother did not recall that 2 orbs had separated themselves from the main craft. That indicates that there was a recollection of a longer sequence of events. And it would also seem that the women were on a specific target of the event, rather than that they were a random discovery by the UFOnauts. The location? Would surprise you to find out that the Bennetts lived on DeForest Lake, and that their experience occurred only a mile from the McMahon-Federico incident. In the course of information collecting for Harry's documentary, Bud had asked Mac if he had ever dreamed about his experience. And indeed he had, though he was embarrassed to discuss it. In the interval between then and the airing of the documentary, the amnesia barrier began to erode in both Mac and Federico, and they were able to start piecing together a full-blown abduction experience, including many details similar to those we've previously discussed, like being taken aboard a ship for an examination at the hands of small frightened beings with depthless black eyes. I'd like you to keep in mind that these events took place before the Stephen Kilburn, Howard Rich, or even David Oldham cases had been explored, making these events singular to the knowledge of all concerned at that time. Mac described the beings as being completely compassionless and utilitarian in their mannerisms. The main examiner wore a high-collared uniform like old doctors, and the lessers were muscular like real humans with larger heads, only 5 feet tall. Their skin was described as plastic, or at least harder than ours, which was later how 3 others separately verified that same detail. Mac's story then came together with Stephen Kilburn's to complete Harry's documentary, which culminated with the filming of Stephen's hypnotic session with Dr. Claymore, where we now learn in Chapter 5, later on in this book, that he remembered he had bent down toward the dash in an attempt to retrieve a flashlight from the glove compartment to use in self-defense against a uniformed ufonaut gazing in his driver's door window. Somewhere out there, something like this is happening tonight, folks. Be safe. I'm Joe Hero, your host, with another episode of Somewhere Out There.